The wind above 8,000 meters doesn't howl, it screams. And on the night Michael Matthews vanished, that scream swallowed every voice on the mountain. Imagine this: a young British climber, only 22 years old, freshly crowned as the youngest Brit to ever stand on the summit of Everest, now fighting for his life in the death zone. Snow tearing sideways like shards of glass, visibility collapsing to almost nothing, and somewhere along the southeast ridge Michael disappears into the storm. No radio call, no final sighting, just gone. At first, people said it was simply the mountain Everest doing what Everest does, punishing the smallest mistake. But then, weeks later, climbers from the same expedition started whispering something wasn't right. Something mechanical, something that had nothing to do with courage or strength or even the storm itself. They claimed the team had been using improper oxygen bottle adapters, adapters that didn't fit the bottles, adapters that leaked, adapters that could silently cut oxygen flow, right when a climber needed it most. So what really happened to Michael Matthews during his descent? Did the storm take him, or did a faulty piece of equipment seal his fate? Long before the weather closed in, tonight, we walk through the final hours of his life, step by step, decision by decision, in the thin, deadly air above the world. And by the end, you'll decide for yourself whether this was a tragic accident or an avoidable disaster. This is Ben's Stories, where every step on Everest tells a deeper truth. If you want more real, untold mountain stories like this one, feel free to follow along. Now, let's go back to where Michael's final climb began. Before the storm, before the summit, before the controversy over leaking oxygen bottles, Michael Matthews was simply a young man with a dream, one so big, so wildly ambitious, that even seasoned climbers raised an eyebrow when they heard it. He wasn't a lifelong mountaineer. He wasn't a hardened expedition veteran. He wasn't even someone who grew up in a home obsessed with adventure sports. Michael was, instead, the kind of young man who saw limits as suggestions. Born in London in 1981 to a successful family, Michael grew up with opportunities many could only imagine. But comfort never softened him. If anything, it sharpened him. He wasn't content with the predictable, the safe, the expected. Those who knew him described him as fearless, but not reckless. Someone who studied every challenge he took on. Someone who prepared, trained, and pushed himself harder than anyone asked him to. And somewhere between his early 20s and that fateful climb, mountains became his language. He trained relentlessly. He climbed in the Alps. He joined expeditions in harsh, remote terrain to prove to himself more than anyone that he could handle cold, thin air, and long hours of climbing. He learned quickly, absorbed techniques like a sponge, and threw himself into the brutal conditioning needed for high-altitude expeditions. But Everest is a different world. When he told his family he wanted to attempt it, the reaction wasn't excitement, it was fear. His older brother, Spencer Matthews, would later describe it. There was no stopping Michael once he set a goal. Everest wasn't a fantasy to him. It was a target. At that time, commercial expeditions were booming. Companies offered climbing packages with Sherpa support, fixed ropes, supplemental oxygen, everything a novice climber needed to stand on the highest point on Earth. For some, it was the democratization of adventure. For others, it was a ticking time bomb. Inexperienced climbers being led into a place where experience is the only thing that keeps you alive. Michael joined a guided expedition that spring. His team included seasoned guides, Sherpas with legendary strength, and several clients with varying levels of experience. On paper, it was a typical Everest group. But looking back, many would argue there were red flags from the beginning. The expedition faced delays due to weather. The acclimatization rotations were shorter and more rushed than some climbers preferred. There was chatter about equipment issues in base camp. And most concerning of all, some climbers later claimed that the oxygen system didn't inspire confidence. In the death zone, oxygen isn't a luxury, it's survival. A misfitting regulator, a leaking adapter, or a faulty mask can turn a strong climber into a stumbling, hypoxic victim in minutes. Still, Michael pushed forward, not out of ego but because he trusted the team, trusted the system, and believed he had trained well enough to deserve his place on that mountain. Climbing Everest is not a single event. It's a series of days. Base camp to Camp 1. Camp 1 through the Western Col to Camp to Up Lots Face to Camp 3. Camp 3 to Camp 4 on the South Col. Each step higher, the human body dies a little. The heart hammers harder. The brain starves for oxygen. Muscles turn sluggish. Thoughts slow. Michael felt all of this, but he handled it. Guides later said he kept pace. He listened. He followed instructions. He wasn't a burden to the team, nor did he ever show signs of panic or distress. By the time they reached the South Col Camp 4, Michael was physically exhausted, but mentally steady, restless, determined, focused. Summit day was set. The weather window was small, dangerously small, but in Everest climbing, tiny windows still count as windows. Teams across the south side prepared to push for the top. Michael followed the same routine as everyone else. Warm up the oxygen system. Test the regulator. Check the mask seal. Secure harness and layers. Clip into the fixed line. But later, long after the tragedy, some climbers from the expedition would claim they'd struggled with their oxygen systems. Some said the flow was inconsistent. Some said the adapters were the wrong type. Some said they'd reported the issue and were told it was fine. If that is true, then summit night began with a silent time bomb. But in the dark, cold hours before dawn, Michael didn't know any of that. He stepped out from the South Kernel like every climber does, with a mix of fear, determination, and awe. The stars above the Himalayas looked close enough to touch. The trail of headlamps snaked upward across the icy slope. The air was thin enough to make every breath feel like sipping through a straw. And still, Michael climbed higher, step by step, into the darkness, toward a sunrise he would never see. By mid-morning, he stood on the summit of Mount Everest, the youngest Brit ever to do so. He smiled, took photos, and radioed down that he felt strong. But Everest doesn't care how strong you feel at the top. It only cares how prepared you are for the way down. And soon, far too soon, Michael Matthews would discover that the descent, not the ascent, is where most climbers meet their fate. Reaching the top of Everest is a moment people dream about for a lifetime. But for Michael Matthews, that moment lasted only minutes, and every minute that followed pushed him closer to the edge of survival. At 22 years old, he stood on the summit at 8,848 meters, the youngest Brit to ever do it. Climbers who saw him reported that he looked tired, exhausted, naturally, but not unstable. He was functioning, alert, and proud. The world beneath him stretched in every direction. Tibet to the north, Nepal to the south, and a horizon so sharp it looked carved with a knife. But there was something else on that summit. Something invisible. Something deadly. The wind. It was stronger than forecasts had predicted. Clouds were moving in from the west, big, thick, fast-moving clouds. No one panicked yet, but the guides could feel it. On Everest, storms don't approach gradually. They explode, still. Summits don't wait. When your time is up, you turn back. And Michael did. He clipped into the fixed line and began his descent down the Hillary Step area, then toward the south summit. That's when climbers first noticed something strange. Michael was slowing down. Not dramatically, not dangerously slow, just oddly slow for someone who had moved efficiently all night. Descending should be easier. Gravity helps. But Michael's pace was inconsistent, strong for a few minutes, then sluggish, then strong again. Anyone who has spent time in the death zone knows what that looks like. Hypoxia, low oxygen, foggy thinking, weak steps, breathing that doesn't match the effort. But here's the key. Michael was using supplemental oxygen. So why did he look like someone who wasn't? One climber, years later, would make a chilling observation. It looked like his mask wasn't giving him enough. It was subtle, but you could see it in the way he moved. At around the same time, the weather hit sudden, brutal, and unforgiving. Snow blasted sideways across the ridge. Visibility dipped to just a few meters. The fixed ropes iced over. Climbers huddled low and continued inching down the mountain, praying the storm wouldn't grow worse. Michael struggled more noticeably now. He slipped once, recovered, slipped again, recovered. Each time, the Sherpas near him encouraged him, telling him to stay focused, to keep moving, to breathe slow, to rely on the rope. But if his oxygen flow really was inconsistent, if his mask or regulator was leaking, then each breath he took was giving him less than he thought. And up there, less than you think is the difference between life and collapse. By the time he reached the balcony area, the storm was a full whiteout. Teams scattered. Climbers could barely see their own boots. Radios crackled with half-finished messages as wind drowned them out. Somewhere in this chaos, the final confirmed sighting of Michael was made. Different accounts vary slightly, but most agree he was still clipped in, still descending, still moving slowly, but moving. He was never seen again. The disappearance mountains do not swallow people cleanly. Normally, something is found: gear, a glove, a pack, even a trace. But in Michael's case, the mountain offered nothing. No body, no equipment, no final radio call, just absence. The storm raged for hours, potentially blowing climbers off ridges, into gullies, over the Kangshan face, or under avalanches triggered by the sudden pressure shifts. Guides searched as long as they could, but in the death zone, time is not yours to spend freely. The cold was too much, the oxygen too thin, visibility too close to zero. When they finally returned to the South Col, exhausted and shaken, they knew the truth they didn't want to say aloud. Michael Matthews was gone. Back at base camp, word spread quickly. Climbers exchanged fragments of information, trying to piece together the timeline. But something didn't sit right with many of them. Michael was strong. He was trained. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't inexperienced in a reckless way. And yet, he deteriorated fast, too fast. One Sherpa later shared privately that he believed Michael had problems with the oxygen. He didn't specify whether it was the mask, the regulator, or the adapter, but he insisted it wasn't working right. Others backed this up. Some climbers from the same team said they'd struggled with their own systems. Some said they felt a drop in flow. Some said they noticed hissing leaks from the connectors. And still others claimed they reported it before Summit Bush. But the issue was dismissed. Years later, when the Matthews family started asking questions, the deeper story began to emerge. The wrong adapters' Everest oxygen systems rely on tight compatibility between bottle valves, regulators, flow meters, masks, and connectors. If any one part doesn't match, you can still force it to fit, but it won't seal properly. Tiny gaps mean tiny leaks, and tiny leaks in the death zone aren't tiny at all. Imagine this scenario. You're climbing at 8,500 meters. You think your oxygen flow is a solid 2 liters per minute. In reality, it's 1.2 or 0.8, or occasionally drops to 0 for a few seconds. You won't notice immediately. Your brain will, your body will, your coordination will. And then hypoxia creeps in so quietly that you won't even realize you're in danger. This is what some climbers claimed was happening on Michael's team. The adapters used to connect regulators to the bottles were supposedly not the standard type for that expedition. If the claims are true, the implications are devastating. Michael may have walked into the death zone with a failing lifeline. The family's questions when Michael's brother Spencer began investigating years later. He found the same inconsistencies, the same contradictions, the same unanswered questions. The expedition leaders denied everything. They said the oxygen systems were fine. They said the storm was the only culprit. They said Michael simply fell behind and vanished into the weather. But Spencer didn't believe it, and he wasn't alone. Many experienced climbers know the truth. Climbers rarely just vanish without a trace, unless something has gone very, very wrong. And the biggest question of all, if the oxygen system had functioned properly, would Michael have survived the storm? That question haunting, controversial, And still unresolved became the center of the investigation that would follow. And that is where we go next. In the months and years that followed Michael Matthews' disappearance, grief slowly turned into questions that no one in the climbing world seemed eager to answer. To most of the public, his death was filed away as just another Everest tragedy, a young climber caught in a storm and overwhelmed by the death zone. But to his family, to his brother Spencer, and to several Sherpas and climbers who had been part of that expedition, the story felt far from complete. Mount Everest is a place where truth becomes slippery. There are no police, no black boxes, no surveillance, only wind, ice, memory, and fear. And when lives, reputations, and money are involved, memories shift, details blur, people forget, or choose to. But Spencer Matthews didn't forget. He refused to. He began collecting every detail he could find: interviews, summit logs, Sherpa accounts, expedition ration records, oxygen bottle serial numbers, photographs, weather reports, and even informal conversations held in tea houses, base camps, and remote Himalayan villages. Piece by piece, he attempted to reconstruct his brother's final hours. What he found didn't add up neatly. In fact, it only deepened the mystery. 1. The oxygen adapter issue: fact, rumor, or cover-up. The most explosive allegation came from multiple climbers within the expedition, who privately stated that the oxygen systems had mismatched components. Specifically, the bottle valves and the regulator connectors were not designed for each other. To make them fit, the team allegedly used third-party adapters. In everyday life, using an adapter seems harmless, but at 8,500 meters, where every breath counts, an imperfect seal can mean oxygen escaping into the air, irregular flow rates, pressure drops, masks failing to deliver enough air, or equipment freezing more easily in sudden wind gusts. Even a small leak can feel like trying to breathe through a pinhole. The allegations were not made publicly. Everest climbers rarely accuse openly, because doing so risks reputations, access to future expeditions, and relationships with Sherpa teams and outfitters. But privately, several individuals echoed the same concern. It wasn't working right. There were leaks. My regulator hissed. I didn't feel like I was getting enough. The expedition leadership, however, strongly denied the claims. They insisted the gear was standard and functioning. Without Michael's body or equipment recovered, the truth was impossible to prove, but also impossible to disprove. 2. Inconsistencies in timelines. When Spencer reviewed the expedition logs, the timing of events during the descent didn't align perfectly with witness accounts. Some climbers claimed Michael was last seen high on the ridge. Others placed him much lower. Some thought he was ahead. Others believed he was behind. The storm made everything chaotic, of course, but discrepancies bothered Spencer. 3 separate climbers mentioned something subtle but important. Michael slowed down sharply around the balcony. A slowdown like that typically means mask issues, regulator freeze, insufficient oxygen, or early hypoxia, yet none of the official reports mentioned any equipment trouble. Why? 3. The Sherpa accounts. Sherpas rarely speak publicly about controversies. Their culture values harmony, not conflict. Accusations can jeopardize livelihoods. But in quiet conversations, Spencer managed to speak with several Sherpas who had worked on the expedition. One said he was strong. Something happened suddenly. Another, he was breathing hard, too hard for someone on oxygen. And the most telling of all, his mask. Maybe not right. None accused the team directly, but none denied the possibility that gear issues played a role. Sherpas know the sounds of malfunction: hissing valves, uneven breathing, or climbers touching their mask repeatedly. They know the look of a climber whose oxygen flow is failing. Their unease added weight to the suspicions. 4. The storm deadly, but not unusual. Critics of the investigation argued the storm alone was enough to explain Michael's disappearance. Everest storms kill experienced climbers every year. Zero visibility, high winds, sudden cold. It can overwhelm even the strongest. But this storm was not extraordinary. It was fast, yes, brutal, yes, but not unprecedented, and dozens of climbers survived it. For Spencer, this fact remained a pillar of doubt. If everyone else in Michael's group made it down despite the weather, why didn't he? Why did Michael deteriorate faster than climbers older, weaker, or less fit? Unless something else had already weakened him. 5. The guide response guides were defensive when questions began circulating. Some refused interviews. Others stated the investigation was pointless. A few openly criticized the Matthews family for looking for someone to blame. But Spencer wasn't looking for blame. He was looking for truth and possibly closure. The guide's accounts did provide useful information, though. Most of them insisted they never saw Michael in distress. Some claimed he fell behind, but none reported seeing signs of a climber in severe hypoxia, confusion, removing gloves, wandering off the rope, slurred speech. That absence of signs is either evidence that he was fine, or evidence that he deteriorated after the last guide saw him. Which brings up the biggest question: did Michael run out of oxygen? If his system was leaking, his bottle could have emptied early. If pressure dropped, his flow could have dwindled. If the mask iced over, he might not have noticed until too late. And if the storm hit at that exact moment, then he would have been overwhelmed within minutes. 6. No body, nitrogen monoxide gear, nitrogen monoxide closure. Most climbers lost on Everest remain visible for decades, preserved by ice. Bodies fall but rarely disappear completely. Michael's disappearance left investigators with very little physical evidence. Without a body, you can't examine the regulator, check the adapter, test the oxygen mask, inspect the bottle, look for signs of a fall, assess injuries. This absence is why the oxygen theory survives to this day. 7. The unspoken truth of Everest. Everest has a long, quiet history of gear problems that never reach headlines. Climbers have died from frozen regulators, wrong mask models, incompatible connectors, misthreaded valves, cracked hoses, improperly tested cylinders, but these stories stay buried because no one wants to challenge expedition operators. The business is too big, the bureaucracy too tangled, and the mountain itself, well, it never explains. Michael's death fit too neatly into a narrative everyone understood. A young climber, caught in a storm, lost in the death zone. But the deeper you look, the less neat the story becomes. And for Spencer, the deeper he dug, the more one conclusion emerged. Michael didn't die because he was inexperienced. He died because something failed him. We follow Spencer's journey as he chases answers across continents, into Nepal, into the climbing community, and into the uncomfortable truth that some people would rather forget. After Michael's disappearance, the Matthews family faced a dual struggle: mourning a young life cut tragically short, and navigating the opaque, often insular world of high-altitude mountaineering. For Spencer, it became clear that answers wouldn't come passively. The mountain had taken his brother, and the climb's aftermath had left questions buried under bureaucracy, pride, and fear. One returned to Nepal determined to understand what truly happened. Spencer Matthews traveled to Nepal the following climbing season. Base camp, normally bustling with climbers, guides, and trekkers, was quieter now, though the dangers remained constant. Spencer walked the frozen trails, spoke with Sherpas who had been on Michael's team, and revisited every log he could find. One Sherpa, hesitant at first, finally spoke candidly. Michael was strong, but something in the oxygen, it wasn't right. He didn't say it, but I could see it in how he breathed. Another added, storm is storm, but if equipment works, you survive longer. If not, the mountain finishes you quickly. Spencer realized that in the world of Everest, admitting faults often comes with risk. Sherpas rely on repeat contracts. Expedition leaders manage reputations. Nobody wanted to say aloud that a simple piece of equipment and oxygen adapter might have cost Michael his life, but the stories aligned. Multiple witnesses reported subtle symptoms of hypoxia, equipment issues, and odd inconsistencies in the descent timeline. 2. The expedition logs. Spencer dug deeper into expedition logs, noting times elevations, and oxygen usage. Patterns emerged. Michael's oxygen bottle was scheduled for replacement every few hours. Logs indicated he may have run low earlier than planned. Several climbers reported hissing sounds from the regulator. Equipment inspection forms were incomplete, lacking proper verification signatures. No definitive proof existed, but a troubling picture was forming. Michael may have been struggling with faulty gear as he navigated one of the most dangerous sections, the South Col and the Hillary Step. 3. The community reacts. Spencer also spoke with veteran climbers familiar with the death zone. Many expressed frustration. Oxygen systems failing is a silent killer. Commercial expeditions sometimes prioritize summit success over equipment safety. Pressure to achieve records like being the youngest Brit to summit can push climbers to ignore red flags. One retired mountaineer told Spencer, "Everest will punish in ways people never expect. Hypoxia is sneaky. You look fine, but your body is betraying you. One faulty adapter, one leak, and you're done." These candid insights reinforced a difficult truth. Michael's death was not just a storm story. It was also a cautionary tale about human reliance on technology in extreme conditions, and how even small errors can have catastrophic consequences. 4. Media and perception outside Nepal. Media coverage was brief. Headlines celebrated Michael's record-setting summit, then shifted focus as expeditions continued. Few reported the equipment concerns, and fewer still explored the family's questions. Spencer recognized a painful reality. Public fascination often focuses on triumph, not tragedy or the subtle failures that cause it. Michael's story, an extraordinary achievement overshadowed by a preventable catastrophe, risked being reduced to a footnote in Everest's long ledger of fatalities. 5. The emotional burden. Spencer also faced emotional challenges. Conversations with Sherpas and climbers were difficult. They involved both loyalty and regret. Some expressed sorrow but avoided blame. Others remained silent. The mountain, the storm, and human error combined to create a narrative that was impossible to untangle neatly. Through it all, Spencer maintained a clear focus. Michael's story deserved truth, clarity, and context. It deserved to serve as a lesson for climbers, families, and the broader Everest community. 6. Lessons learned from these investigations. A few critical insights emerged. Equipment integrity is paramount. Even small mistakes in oxygen systems at extreme altitude can be fatal. Communication matters. Red flags must be reported and acted upon immediately. Experience alone isn't enough. Even strong climbers can succumb to hypoxia when gear fails. Community transparency is limited. Expeditions often conceal mistakes to protect reputations, making post-incident investigations difficult. The human cost of Everest is high. Every summit has risk. Every decision matters. Spencer's journey illustrated the complexities of Everest tragedies. They are rarely simple, rarely predictable, and often obscured by layers of human, mechanical, and environmental factors. 7. A family's determination. By the end of his investigations, Spencer accepted what he could not change. Michael's body was likely gone forever, but the unanswered questions and the lessons his brother's death highlighted were too important to ignore. He began speaking openly, cautiously, to educate other climbers about the risks of oxygen failure, the dangers of rushed summits, and the importance of meticulous equipment checks. Michael's story became both a warning and a memorial, a reminder that Everest demands respect, preparation, and vigilance. No summit, no record, no ambition is worth sacrificing safety. Michael Matthews' disappearance remains one of Everest's most haunting modern stories. A young man with ambition, training, and skill vanished in the stormy expanse of the world's tallest peak. For many, his death is a tragic statistic in the ledger of Everest fatalities. For those who knew him, and for his family, it is a story of unanswered questions, silent hazards, and a life cut short too soon. What makes Michael's story stand apart is the combination of triumph and tragedy. he achieved the remarkable feat of summiting Everest. At just 22 years old, the youngest Brit to do so. But the very tools meant to safeguard him may have failed at the most critical moment. A faulty oxygen system, mismatched adapters, or leaks small, almost invisible issues can become lethal above 8,000 meters. In a way, Michael's climb reflects the razor-thin margin between life and death on Everest, where success and catastrophe coexist in the same breathless, wind-lashed air. The investigation that followed highlights the complex realities of high-altitude mountaineering. Everest is not a forgiving environment. Equipment matters. Preparation matters. The judgment of guides and climbers matters. And yet, even with every precaution, the mountain retains the ultimate authority. No technology, no expertise, no ambition can fully control the elements. Spencer Matthews' efforts to uncover the truth teach another lesson. Closure is often elusive, but seeking understanding is vital. By piecing together eyewitness accounts, Sherpa testimonies, and expedition logs, he honored his brother's memory while educating the climbing community about preventable risks. Michael's story is a cautionary tale not just about Everest, but about the fragile boundary between human determination and the uncompromising laws of nature. For climbers, adventurers, and even armchair explorers, there is a message in Michael's journey. Preparation, vigilance, and respect for the mountain are non-negotiable. Mistakes, no matter how small, can have irreversible consequences. Everest does not forgive carelessness. And yet, the allure remains. Summiting the world's highest peak is a dream that continues to draw thousands, each carrying hope, ambition, and the ever-present shadow of risk. Michael Matthews' story is both extraordinary and tragic, a young life defined by courage, ambition, and the ultimate test of human limits. His legacy endures not only in the records he set, but also in the lessons he leaves behind. For anyone daring to challenge the death zone, if you want to learn more gripping stories of Everest, K2, and the world's deadliest mountains, make sure to subscribe to Ben's Stories. Hit the bell, stay bold, and never underestimate the mountains or the lessons they teach.